Your hosts are the Great Order and No White Guilt. And this is the one and only, the After Party. The crown winner of last week, folks. That crown winner is Zero Talent again, financially gifting $50 US. God bless you, dear brother. Thank you so very much. Congratulations. In second place, the one and only, ladies and gentlemen, White Student Transmission, financially gifting $20 US. Thank you and congratulations to you as well. 15% cost to you, ladies and gentlemen, when you financially gift over on that wonderful platform known as Entropy. And those amazing people working hard for free speech deserve every penny of that 15%. In fact, at some point in the very near future, we will be able to stream directly to Entropy itself. You can hop on over there in a moment. I'll have the stream up there. You can vote on questions. You can ask questions. They don't disappear unless you or I delete them. You can also financially gift at no cost to you. That's no cost to you or us at Cash App. Grab onto that rope, rappel down into the description for the URLs for both. As you all know, Jared and I evenly share the financial gifts with our guests here on the After Party. Today, we have the one and only, ladies and gentlemen, poet extraordinaire, Nullus, on tap with us. Nullus, please introduce yourself to our esteemed community. Tell them where they can find you, and then the one and only Mr. George will take us into the conversation.
Well, first of all, hello, No White Guilt. Hello, Jared, and hello to the audience. And my main page is abnormocracy.com. It's abnormal democracy. So abnormocracy.com. You can also reach me on YouTube or on Twitter under the same name at Nullus. It's at abnormocracy.com. And then I also have a YouTube page, an Odysee page, all under the same name. I'm also on Gab under Nullus. And I'm also on Telegram, but it's all the same name, essentially, Abnormocracy. So that's pretty much where you can find me. And of course, I'm also on affiliated with the White Art Collective, where I will be having my poetry and literature podcast starting in the fall, late October, early November. The Conversations with the Wind will start around that time. And I also co-host, with Donald Kent, the Imperium Art Project, where we are going to have Jared on the upcoming episode.
Yep, I'm looking forward to that. That is this Thursday at 6 Eastern, which is 11 across the pond in the UK. And we'll be talking about art and culture like they do on that show. And they'll be grilling me about questions that are tough to answer, like creative process and things like that. But Jason did a good job with that when I was on Going Free on Sunday, and I know we'll have a great conversation with Nullus and Donald. But Nullus, it's your first time here on tap. So as anyone that saw the promo may know, we're going to talk about Hungary because that's where your roots go back to, and it's been in the news a little bit, always on people's minds about one of the countries in Europe that is taking a bit of a different course than a lot of the others. So there's some things to talk about there. But first, before we get to that, since it's your first time on the show, you know, we always like to hear people's stories. So take your time. But how did you get here? How did you end up saying to yourself, something's wrong, and then something's wrong, and I have to do something about it publicly? Well, maybe we could start way back. Did you always, when you were young, when you were a kid, did you always have some sense of heritage? Were you raised with that, or is it something that came later? Would you say that you were anti-white at any time in your life, or imbibing in that, or were you always kind of aware that things were off? Take it away.
Well, I believe that I'd have to start with my upbringing, and I would say that I had a very unique experience where I spent a lot of time in Europe as well as here in the United States. And just to start off, I'm basically first generation in my family to be born in the United States. Both of my parents are Hungarian, and they fled after the Hungarian uprising of 1956. Incidentally, they met here in the United States. So, that's kind of a nice romantic twist to it, actually.
Were they both living in a Hungarian community or set up by relatives?
Back then you had a much more vibrant Hungarian community where I live. Sadly, it's declined since then. But after the uprising, about 200,000 people fled to the West in general. So you had these large communities, and the older communities from earlier generations were then supplemented by the new arrivals. So in a sense, it's very interesting because I was raised speaking Hungarian and learning about the culture and traditions here in the United States.
Right.
And I've always identified as ethnically Hungarian, but this was not always easy because I would grow up among those who didn't understand this background, what we'll call, quote unquote, the Americans, right? I mean, again, that's a very outdated kind of a way of putting it, but I hope that makes sense. But fortunately, I also grew up in a very tight-knit Hungarian extended community where I lived, and I was able to make friends with people of similar backgrounds. And that also helped me clarify the identity, because when you're not alone, when you're in a community, it helps you encourage your own identity. It gives you that confidence that you can stay that person in spite of everyone else maybe around you being different. I also spent about 11 years in Europe. That's a completely different topic, but I did spend quite a bit of time there.
I don't want to gloss over that. So if you're getting to another point first, we'll make sure we circle back to that, because I always like to hear about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just maybe put a bookmark to this and say that I basically grew up being eventually grew into becoming a staunch Hungarian nationalist. But I was also exposed to the greater community of the European man through my living here in the United States, living in Europe. And I was able to learn and appreciate that we're all connected on a very deep level, often despite our differences. And I guess you could say that while my feet are firmly rooted in my Hungarian identity, I'm also connected to the greater community of our great European brotherhood. And I think that's a very much, I can attribute most of that to my unique upbringing and experiences.
So that was always the case. You always had that wider sense.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about those nested layers.
Yeah.
I sometimes use every hypothetical, or really metaphor, really. Hypothetical is not the best word in this case, but metaphor is imperfect. But I like to use that Russian doll nested layer kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you always had that. You always had that, even though you were, I'm sure, because of language and how pronounced your ethnic markers were as a Hungarian, I'm sure you also felt a little bit different than other European descended peoples in the States.
Yes.
But could you talk to that? Maybe not as much as others who are non-Western. What was your sense of that growing up?
Well, of course, back then, when you said American, to me at least, and to my generation, it meant essentially white. That was equated as the same thing. So if you were an American, you were white. If there wasn't a necessary distinction between what it meant to be American. It was just understood that it was white.
Interesting to hear that. I don't want to cut you off, but we hear a lot these days about how, only until recently, just a few decades ago in living memory, the Irish or the Polish or the Italians or the this or the that, it was very different. And yeah, we're not going to gloss over the fact that, of course, there are ethnic enclaves in cities, and people are aware through language and food and customs and some different traditions they have of their differences. And yeah, there were differences, and sometimes there were tensions. But I feel it's interesting to talk to you, and I want to hear about your generational perspective on this. Do you think that is exaggerated these days to our detriment, part of the narrative, the anti-white narrative?
Absolutely. But maybe I would preface that by saying, so growing up in an ethnic community, you always defined yourself by your ethnicity, and everyone else was the American, quote unquote. But then again, to the Polish community, I was the American. So it was this kind of bizarre kind of relationship. But then when you met somebody who was Polish or more in tune with their original ethnicity, if that makes sense. See, the United States is a very special place in many ways, and in a very positive way, I think, too. But you have a whole many different communities of European descent all over the place. Some are more assimilated, others are less assimilated. But over time, I think that if there's no injection of the of new people from the old world, then over time, all of these communities essentially assimilate into the greater whole and then become American within maybe 2, 3, or 4 generations. Now, to those, and then of course, like myself, we try to maintain the old ways. We try to nourish that, but we also want to be a part of the community, the greater community. Back then, it was kind of understood. You had friendly competition with other groups, the Irish or some Germans or Polish or what have you, Italians and what have you. But it was never really about who was better. It was just you were different and you had something unique to give. Sometimes kids make fun of each other, obviously, but that's a different story.
Yeah, but there's levels of that. You could get that in different regions and towns in the country as well. As I said, we have to be realistic about the fact that there's layers to identity. Yeah. And I say that not to confuse or befuddle the matter. I know sometimes when you speak publicly, it's tough because my instinct is to look for the nuance in things, but I understand that when you're speaking to mass audiences, sometimes a little too much nuance, it could confuse people or it can water down or dilute a message. But in this particular instance, I feel it's always important to be to really parse through it and for all of us to be clear on it, precisely because, as you were saying, as we're talking about right now, the anti-whites will use this sort of thing against us and try to get us off balance if we don't understand the fact that it's not an either or thing. You could be proud to be Hungarian. You could be proud of the particular region you're from in Hungary. You could be proud of your general Western civilizational identity. All of these things, there's a flow among all of them. And it's a lot of people these days get thrown off by that narrative of, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, well, just a few generations ago, the Italians and the Polish and the this and the that all didn't like each other in the States. So what, your identity now is just, it's this cobbled together fiction or something like that. We have to be very aware of those insidious narratives that they try to weasel in.
I mean, the way I would define it is if you're in the United States, then that applies 100% the way you just said it. If you're in Europe, then that would apply in more of a kind of not a United States of Europe, but a federation of European states, where you would have a federation of Europeans understanding their uniqueness, understanding their particular regional identities, their region, their countries, but they also understand the need for a greater community and working together. If you go back in history, during the Crusades or even during the various invasions of Europe by the Mongols or the Ottomans, we were most effective when we worked together in spite of our differences. And I think that you can, and I'm always going to say that above everything else, I am a Hungarian. I mean, that is my primary identity, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's, I don't like this hierarchies of identity. I think that the way I look at it more of a kind of a synergies of identity, where these identities belong to each other and you can't just rip one out from the other. They flow into each other. They're dependent on each other. They help each other grow. They help each other get stronger. And this relates to my religious identity as a Catholic. It relates to my ethnic identity as a Hungarian. It relates to my greater identity as a man of European descent, as a white man. So all of these things are connected and they all belong together.
Very well said. I agree with you about the synergy. It's a great way to put it. And again, I know sometimes these talks about identity, they get a little abstract, but we do need to be clear on these things, because that's what I meant a few moments ago when I said metaphors have limits. I do use the Russian doll metaphor sometimes. It's just one way to visualize things. But I agree with you. If that gives a sense of levels, and levels then imply hierarchy, I agree with you. It's not this linear hierarchical thing so much as this swirl and an interpenetration of all of these things. Just like a man in your more personal life, you wouldn't say, well, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a brother, when you look at your family, or I'm a member of my town, or I'm a coach for Little League. You wouldn't say these things like, well, let me pick this apart and what's more important. Your day-to-day experience, of course, is they all reinforce each other. And it's this system. There's an integrity to this self-sustaining system. So it is important to talk about. But I do know that there are people who would ask, I think, an important question. Maybe more would be European, but there are Americans aware of this too. But so you were saying that all the people of European descent, when you grew up, more or less understood as American. I think that's a tacit admission, as we speak about here, that of course America is a Western country. It's a Western culture. It's part of Western civilization. But the question that some might pose would be, what are some of the potential downfalls of that Americanization? Were you or were your parents concerned that you would lose the Hungarian language and ethnic markers and food, and maybe not marry a Hungarian girl? And where are the balances there?
Well, that's an eternal question every immigrant community from Europe had to face at one time or another.
Yeah.
And some communities thrived longer than others. Some assimilated quicker than others. Maybe it had to do with the relationship they had with the neighboring communities, or it had more to do with the next generation where they lived. If they lived in let's say a working class neighborhood, and then the next generation got wealthier and they moved out to the suburbs, that completely changes their perspective again, and also the community in which they lived, and their identities also evolve through the generations. Intermarriage is another thing. But for me personally, this is a tough question, to be honest with you. For me personally, the way we kind of were, well, in theory again, the way we grew up was that leaving Hungary was not a voluntary thing for my parents. They had to leave because they would have faced repercussions from the communist regime because they participated in the uprising. And for them, the idea was that at some point in time, they want to go back home. And the goal was not to stay here permanently. The goal was to stay here and then go home. Now, sadly, as fate had it, school, career, the time goes by very quickly. Not everybody goes back. And in my case, sadly, I didn't have the opportunity. Well, I had the opportunity, but something always came in between and I never went back. But it's a constant theme for me to say that, I love this country. Don't misunderstand me. I love the United States. I appreciate a lot of things in the United States. I love the people here, salt of the earth people, really, the best of friends I've made here all over the place. So it's not about, denigrating the United States, but it's where my heart is, where my soul belongs. And so I've been wrestling with this for quite a long time. And so where do I belong, right? That's the tough question for someone like myself. If you're like second or third or fourth generation, it's much easier to deal with it. But if you're first generation, where you have a very strong tie, or especially in my case, where I spent some time in Europe, where you have a very strong tie with Europe, it's a very difficult kind of decision to make where you want to live, where do you belong. And so in that sense, it is important. It is important for me to have someone, to marry a Hungarian girl, absolutely, because I like the food. But outside of the food, also the language, it's just easier to relate because you have common culture, you have a common tradition, you have an understanding, sometimes an implicit understanding of each other through that shared history. Right. So that's a benefit to it. I hate to be, too reactionary, but even someone who's not Catholic is already difficult for me. Not because I have anything against someone who's a Protestant by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that I have a lot more in common with that person because we share those traditions together. So I know that going forward, it's going to be an easier transition, an easier way to raise the children for the next generation. That doesn't mean, of course, that I'm not going to meet some girl that's Protestant and I'm going to say, no, I'm not going to marry you because you're Protestant. No. It doesn't mean that. But it's just saying preference. It's a question of preference, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a tough one, though.
Do you think that there's anything in a healthier alternate timeline, United States, where we we could have had a little bit more of the best of both worlds, or a better balance, where it's still understood that there is an overall history going back largely to the English that started the U.S. with some other contributions, and that it's understood as a Western, I don't want to say melting pot, because we know what that phrase, how that's been used. I heard back in the day they used to use the word salad bowl more, which is interesting. You don't hear about that, but I've heard recordings of lectures from the earlier part of the 20th century, and the idea was, we're going to be a salad bowl and there's different peoples here, but you don't put a salad in a blender and mix it all up. So I'm curious if you have any sense of if there could have been, if things weren't as subverted as they became, the kind of thing where, different people from Europe could come, and it was kind of this Western salad bowl, and there was something specific about America. We knew its history, but at the same time, these ethnic enclaves still maybe kept their traditions a little bit more robustly than they have.
Well, I mean, if you go back to the Hart-Celler Act, right? I think that's really that watershed moment where it was clearly defined as, inclusive of non-Europeans. And when you open that Pandora's box, then the concept of being American becomes a more relative term, and then that completely destroys the existing identity of those who are occupying that space. Because now, what is it? Because I believe, at least, that's the trick, right? By questioning, what does it mean to be this or that? What does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be Hungarian? What does it mean to be anything? Then what they're doing is they're relativizing the whole thing. So I would say that if that would not have occurred, if we wouldn't have opened that Pandora's box, then I think that a lot of these issues would have been resolved by now. I think that by now we'd have a much more harmonious situation with a very interesting combination of European flavors that would have evolved and was heading that direction, in my opinion, was evolving toward a uniquely American culture, a uniquely American identity that wove in all of these different elements of Europe into it, with some ties to the old country, but also creating new culture out of it. And I think that this was disrupted by opening this Pandora's box.
Again, interesting to hear from your generation that you could see it. You could see the potential there, and maybe, again, on an alternate timeline, imagine in a city, not to always make it about food, because we know that whole restaurant food thing is used, but just as a quick, funny example, you'd go to different quarters or different restaurants in a city, and the ethnic, quote unquote, food, anyone in the States knows that usually means non-white foods. For some reason, they're ethnic, but we're not. Right. But the ethnic restaurants would be Hungarian or German,
right,
or French or this, and it's like, let's go to this tonight, and it's a little, it's those layers that we're saying again, or that synergy, but it would be more particularly Western. Now, as I said, I want to hear about when you went back to Europe. You said you spent 11 years there. So what was that like, and how did that expand your understanding of everything we're talking about now?
Well, that greatly expanded it. So growing up in a Hungarian community in the United States was one challenge, and then I lived in Germany for 11 years, and then going to Germany to spend another few years over there, and immersing yourself in that local culture and understanding the way they think. Then you start to realize, wait a second. First of all, Europeans don't think the same way we do in America. There's a lot of kind of small things. You don't put ice in the water, or all these little things, these nuances that are very trivial, but they do add up, and it kind of makes a difference in how people think. And Europeans are more frugal than the Americans. Americans like the supersized stuff. The Europeans are more portion controlled. Again, I'm just generalizing here, but just to give an idea of these things. And then on top of that, the German identity, understanding what it means to be a German, and relating to the Germans. So to say, I'm in a position now where I have to kind of put an extra layer on my identity so that I can understand the German. Meaning that it doesn't mean that I consider myself German, but it does mean that I am putting the extra layer on to understand them much better, and to relate to them, and to kind of work with them be friends with them. So I would say that I would recommend anyone, by the way, that they should spend at least several years, not just 1 year, but like maybe 2 or 3 years in a European country of their choosing, or in an American state of their choosing, depending on where they're from, and really immerse yourself in that local culture and really get to know the people, because it's not just about the culture, it's also the attitudes that they have, the way they think, perceptions of each other. You're an ambassador of of your country. You're an ambassador of your culture. And as such, you're representing that to these people who might not have had that opportunity to get to know somebody as intimately as they would have through you. And so these are important things, especially in the world that we're living in today, where everybody's saying that, so whites across the world are being attacked. So our goal should be to find bridges and work closer together, find ways for us to understand each other better. And how better to do that than really spending time with each other and learning about each other. And we could do that in various ways. I hope that answered your question. I don't know if I sidetracked too much.
No, sure, it does. Is there anything you can think of from your time in Germany that made you, or just in general, more deeply appreciate what bonds us underneath those little details, like you said, the ice in the water or the frugalness?
Well,
What are the bigger things you sensed?
Yeah. So you'll notice similarities as well. So you'll notice certain traditions. You always thought that this tradition was an American tradition, or you thought it was a Hungarian tradition, and then you go to Germany and you find out that they have the same traditions. And many times you'll find similarities in customs. You'll find similarities in folklore, and you'll find some similarities in mythology. It doesn't mean that they derive from each other. Again, it doesn't mean that they're the same. What you're looking for are those common threads. What you're looking for are those points of convergence where you understand each other better. And I think that you could find that through art, through culture, through the stories that we've told each other. And of course, again, the experiences that you have, like, for example, let's say, well, I mean, I don't want to delve into the history too much, but let's just say, for example, I'm trying to think of something. Let's say a particular experience. Let's say the East-West divide in Germany. So Germany was split in two during the Cold War, and you would have this divide. And of course, that was very prominent in the average German's mind in West Germany at the time. And so, I would relate through my Hungarian experience with them, because of my parents' background and what they had to flee. They had to flee the communists, right? So from my point of view, that was my point of convergence with them on that level. But if it was, for example, a Christmas tune, if you heard, O Tannenbaum or Old Christmas Tree, again, that's a very obvious one, but it's still a good example where you could say, wait a second, it's the same song. They're singing about the same thing. They're celebrating the same thing. So that to me means a lot. That to me is an important point of convergence.
Now, you didn't go and live in Hungary, but I would assume you've visited many times.
Yeah, I've been to Hungary many, many, many times over, my lifetime. But for several occasions, I spent more than 6 months at a time in Hungary. So about maybe 3 or 4 times in my life, I spent over 6 months there. But I've never lived there full time.
What was that like, and what did your relatives and friends there ask you about living in America and being American, and how did they view you as regards all of that?
Well, a lot of times it's also consumerist questions, right? Like, what kind of what do clothes cost so over there as opposed to over here? What kind of food? It's all basic stuff, what kind of food and this and that. When Hungary was still, and this is only in the last few decades, when Hungary was under communist rule, it was a little bit different. And I had some interesting debates with cousins in Hungary about which system is better, whether or not, which is free, which is not free, and how is it free, how is it not free. And maybe I just want to circle back a little bit to identity. I would say that I've always been aware of my identity, but my political ideas over time have changed. when you might recognize that certain ideas were acceptable maybe 20 years ago, but those ideas today might not be as beneficial to us as it was maybe 20 years ago or something. I'm thinking of like more, the idea of freedom and rights and all these things are important, but we have to contextualize it somewhat differently because now it's being weaponized against us, right? And so when we have concepts being weaponized against us, words being weaponized against us, then whatever meant something that many years ago might mean something different. And again, this comes back to speaking with people in Europe because they have a different experience. They might have said, well, for us, we lived under communism. We've experienced all of this. We've seen what it's like to live under that kind of a system. We don't want that anymore. And what we're looking for now is something completely different, and we're heading in a different direction. Now, what that direction is still evolving, I would say.
I want to talk, before we speak specifically about Hungary at the present moment, I want to hear a little about your interest in arts and culture. It's a lot of what you talk about and your poetry, but maybe not only what generally brought you to that, but specifically through the frame of your family's experience with communism, like you just said.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you're very outspoken about the anti-white ideology at the root of it and what it does, and how maybe that colored your work and culture. Maybe you saw, I'm just guessing, but maybe you saw or understood through your family that form, that communism is often a cancer on culture, and perhaps that your interest in culture is a rebuff to that there's that you're trying to assert something that's more native to who we are and unchecked by all of the poisons or the perversions or confusions that often go along with that system when it's actually put into practice.
Well, there's a strong tradition both here in the United States, I think, and in Hungary as well, but throughout Europe, where you use art, you use poetry in particular, to express strong emotions. You use that to express a political idea in a way, or a social idea in a way that resonates with your readers, but also gives them hope. And I think gives them an understanding of where they stand, even if it's, sometimes rhetorical tools are used to either mock or criticize or even denigrate something. And again, not a person or individual, but an idea, for example. And when you're looking at that, those are tools that are used to highlight something is wrong here, right? So that's what I said. And in Hungarian culture, you have a very strong awareness of identity in historically. And Hungarian poetry, going back centuries, has always been defined by its uniqueness. It's a very lyrical language, and it has a very strong resonance in poetry if it's done right. And so the question of identity and the question of being Hungarian, a Hungarian language is very unique in Europe. So there was always this understanding of us being very unique, even in Europe, and so that gave a very particular edge to this art form, and I would say that this also translated into my understanding of how we have to contextualize ourselves as white people all over the world, and how we have to understand and express ourselves artistically, but not just artistically, even politically. We have to look for a way to express the full emotional spectrum, but in a balanced and disciplined manner, so that we understand that people can be who they are unapologetically, without having to resort to anything that leads them down a path where they become the monsters they wish to defeat. And so we that whole aspect is ingrained in Hungarian culture. That aspect of that desire for freedom, that desire for being independent, but also being a collective, being an individual, but also being a part of a greater community. And I think these examples, this is what I'm bringing, at least from my tradition, into the greater whole. I mean, at least I'm hoping. I don't know. I always say, I don't know how good my poems are, and I never really want to qualify that. What I do want to say is that my hope ultimately is always to inspire others who who are much more talented than I am, who are much better than I am, to do this work, to become the great writers, to become the great artists, to become the great thinkers and leaders of our next generations. That's really what I'm hoping for. I can't ask for more than that. And if I can inspire one person, then I think I've done my job, even though I hope to inspire much more.
Just adding on a little bit, do you know from family what communism did to culture and the arts in Hungary when that was the regime?
Sure. The first thing they did when they arrived after 1945, now we have to understand that, let's put the political and ideological aspect of this aside. The events after 1945 throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and this includes Germany's eastern parts, were horrific. The Soviet army invaded these nations, and they not only, and I don't know if I don't know if I can use that word, but the big R word was used. You know, they pillaged and stole and arred the entire way throughout those countries. Many sad stories could be told by Hungarians and Germans alike. So with that being said, once the Soviets came in, then they installed local puppets, and these puppet regimes would essentially first show and air as if there's a sense of legitimacy here and there's a democracy here, and then within a year or two or three, they would completely change it into a totalitarian system. And it's funny that you mentioned, because my parents were actually born in the early 40s, so they were born. They by the time they started school, they were essentially the first generation that were raised in this new system, in this new communist system. And there are countless examples where, you know, I would hear stories from my parents where the communists would try to kind of delegitimize the earlier teachings. They would delegitimize, you know, patriotic culture. They would delegitimize religion. They would delegitimize your identity. They would delegitimize your family. And what they would do then is replace it with something artificial. They would replace it with something that they controlled, and they would replace it with something. And all of this then ultimately translated in the arts. Now, you do have moments, even during socialist Hungary, which is very interesting. You do have moments, and because we have to remember, it was a 40-year span that they ruled. There were moments where they had very patriotic movies. They allowed patriotic sounding, let's say, poets or stories or films or songs. They allowed it, but it was always under a very tightly controlled and edited methodology behind it. And there was always some kind of twist somewhere underneath the surface that always brought people back to that kind of strange, twisted weaponization against the very identity that the art form is presenting. I don't know if that makes any sense, but yes, I hope it does.
It does, yeah. It's almost like they know that this is still the people's instinct and what they want. Right. So they have to allow for an escape valve, but they will still seed the poisonous messages. So exactly. Having said all this, I'm glad that we did do that background, and I hope it's beneficial for those listening, because that is actually a more powerful context and background to now see how much Nullus you must appreciate where we are at the moment, what is happening here in our America and most, unfortunately, other Western nations. And your understanding of that, given your family history and how close you were to this. And if you could then take us into the perceptions about Hungary right now. We know it's been in the news. We know Tucker Carlson recently broadcast from there, and then all of these anti-whites were screeching and saying, well, if you want to go to Hungary in some totalitarian state, then fine. So maybe you could ramp us up into this, and then we'll begin to maybe separate some of the myths from the truths, and how based is Hungary right now? What are some of the pros and cons? What can we learn from it? But at the same time, I'm sure nothing is perfect. But I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on that.
Yeah, maybe I'll wrap up this first part with a moment I had with my mom not that long ago, where we were watching something on television that was very subversive. And my mom just looked at the screen and she said, "Oh my God, it's happening here again."
Wow.
And so when you think about it that way, right? I mean, I'm paraphrasing her, but that was the reaction she had. She saw this, and immediately she identified it with when she was a child, leading up to the uprising. And so, that for me was a very profound moment of understanding.
Yes.
And it's kind of sad, but let's get to Hungary, and I'll try to give you as much of a nutshell as I can. So in understanding Hungary, we'd probably have to go back several centuries, but don't worry, we're not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to just try to focus on the events from 1989 to today, and I'm going to try to make it as brief as possible. But there's a reason why I have to go back that far.
Yeah. And as Nullus speaks, everyone, please get your questions ready, because we're already more than halfway into the show. But we want to make sure that we address some of the questions you may have, again, about the myths versus the reality, and what we can learn, because we hear in our circles, we hear a lot about Hungary, as I'm sure you all know. But please go on, Nullus.
Yeah, so the reason I have to go back to 1989, because that was a pivotal moment where there was a change, you can say, a regime change, a system change, although Hungarians call it the change of gangsters, but suffice it to say, when we talk about Hungary, we always refer to Hungary as a she, by the way, because traditionally Hungarians call it the motherland, right, as opposed to the fatherland. And I should also note that I've been actively following politics in general, but Hungarian politics in particular, for many decades now. So, and I also see a lot of parallels between the struggles my Hungarian nationalist brothers and sisters have faced over the years with the struggles that our greater white brothers and sisters are facing today. A lot of similarities and a lot of growing pains, and also a lot of disappointments and small victories. So we shouldn't always just look at the negatives. But getting back to the point, so toward the fall of the Iron Curtain, these so-called opposition parties, they negotiated a transition with the ruling socialist or communist party in Hungary. And this was called the Roundtable Talks of the 80s. It's a terminology also used in political science. The idea was meant to make the transition into a parliamentary democracy as peaceful as possible. But it also meant that the former communist nomenclature never had to face any form of accountability for their crimes. So, in fact, it kept many kept their accumulated wealth and influence, which gave them an unfair advantage vis-a-vis their opposition counterparts, at least those opposition counterparts that did not get support from the West. So to this day, this is an issue that's persistent. It is a persistent problem, not only in Hungary, but the entire region of the former Eastern Bloc. And again, there are a million explanations why, but I just wanted to mention this as a point of, as a fact, as something that is there, just so that you understand what we're up against and what it is that we're looking at, generally speaking, over there.
Right. Yeah, just because the form of government change doesn't mean, same thing in Russia, although there were significant changes, it doesn't mean that all those bad actors just magically in 1990 weren't there anymore, and they're still not there. We have to remember this.
Yep. What do they say? Energy doesn't disappear; it just transforms, right? And that's what happened in this case. And they just transformed, and they called themselves, socialists or something like that instead of the Workers' Party. So it's just, these slight subtle changes. And this is an important thing for us in the West, in the United States and Western Europe, and in the greater white community, to always pay attention to. Words have a meaning. Words are important. What they say is important. How they express themselves is very important. And so when we're looking into these things, we have to understand what is being said between the lines, not just on the surface. But I'm just going to continue now with just to give a little history on this, and I hope you don't mind, but interrupt me at any time, please.
The context is important, and I mean, we have you here. We want to learn. People are saying they're learning a lot, so please go on. We're enjoying this.
Oh, okay. So at the time, Fidesz, they were considered a liberal party or a neoliberal party, similar to.
And just for clarity, that party right now, is that Orban's party?
That is correct. So Fidesz.
Fidesz.
Yes, Fidesz.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and Hungarian SZ is pronounced with an S. It's a separate letter, actually. So Fidesz is it means basically the Young Democratic Party. I think Szövetség, I think in English is, I can't even translate now. But it's the Young Hungarian Alliance, Democratic Alliance. That's what Fidesz stands for. So it's Young Democratic Alliance. That's what the name Fidesz means. And Orbán is the leader of Fidesz, and he basically was a prominent member of Fidesz from its foundation all the way up to today, and he is the leading figure in that group. But of course, there's a core group around him that have been around since the 80s as well. But anyway, getting back to the history of it, when they were established in the late 80s and early 90s, they were more of a neoliberal kind of progressive party. They were nowhere near socially conservative, let alone nationalistic, patriotic, or Christian. There were, of course, other parties, political parties that represented these conservative right-leaning interests. But over time, Fidesz and Orbán, they decided to move toward the center-right. And some call this, they use the word here, salami tactics, in this case, where Fidesz would essentially slice up all of these other or pre-existing right-wing and conservative parties and incorporate them into the greater Fidesz movements. Others believe that Orbán had a genuine epiphany, and he decided to change the course sometime during the mid-90s. And I'll leave that up to everyone's interpretation. I don't want to suggest one way or the other. I just want to present them both, that there are both schools of thought on this. But even then, Orbán in the 90s was not against the European Union. In fact, he was a strong proponent of joining the European Union, much to the chagrin of many nationalists, because the nationalists were fearful of the European Union because they just came out of another union, right, out of the Warsaw Pact. So for them, NATO or the European Union were it was very suspect to them. What a lot of nationalists wanted back in the day was just to be an independent, neutral country. But of course, that's not to say that there shouldn't be unification among European peoples. But again, when we're looking at this organizationally and politically, then it might have other implications. So if you want to be cynical, I guess you could say that Orbán felt that he had more political opportunities on the right as opposed to the left. But again, I don't want to say one way or the other. Some people believe that he genuinely believes everything that he says. And there is some truth to that as well. So generally speaking, the 1990s in Hungary, it was riddled with corruption, crime, and various forms of depravity, sadly. Pornography, drugs, prostitution, it was rampant, sadly, again. You had a lot of organized crime. You had hits all over the place. You had like these scandals with restaurants overcharging tourists and then trying to, get them to pay exorbitant amounts. It's just ridiculous stuff was going on in the 90s. And the conservatives, they tried to change things, but they were very weak because they really didn't get support from the West. And they also didn't have any kind of assets like the socialists had in the transition. So in spite of being in power for 2 administrations, they really didn't have much influence as much as they thought they would have. Outside of that, everything was very new, and there was a lot of negative influence coming from the West. So there was, of course, positive influences as well. I don't want to just say it was negative, but sadly, the overwhelming influence from the West was negative. For example, under the guise of privatization, a lot of politicians and their cronies, they sold factories and entire industries to Western interests. And again, I'm not talking about the West as the white people or us, right? I'm just talking about Western interests, people in the West, corporations and what have you, who would buy these big factories for pennies to the dollar. And then the politicians and their cronies would pocket a lot of money, buy-offs or whatever, kind of benefits that they got out of it. And sadly, a lot of Westerners also arrived in Central Europe to take advantage of these countries. Of course, again, not all of them did that, but that was very rampant in the 90s. And it was almost like the Wild East, if you will. Now, into this, and again, by the mid-90s, Orbán became more and more centrist. And so the first Orbán government ran from 1998 to 2002. And by that time, Fidesz had fully embraced the civic patriotic position, albeit much more pro-European Union than in later Fidesz administrations. And even today, he's not anti-European Union. He's kind of trying to recontextualize the European Union. And I'm not against that idea, by the way. But suffice it to say, I never really supported Fidesz personally because I was highly suspicious of this drastic turn in their ideology. And it was still, but regardless, it was still a breath of fresh air compared to these disastrous results from these preceding administrations, all this corruption and crime. Then Orbán and Fidesz, they lost in the 2002 elections, and his administration was again replaced by a socialist or former communist and neoliberal coalition administration. It was a narrow loss for Orbán, but I believe that this loss was mainly due to his youth and inexperience. He's in his mid to late 50s, so he's not really an old guy. And so I think that Orbán actually learned quite a bit from that loss. And so by 2010, his whole approach changed. Between 2002 and 2010, Hungary focused on a more aggressive privatization schemes. Again, the same thing that they tried to do in the 90s. It essentially meant political nepotism and theft, as well as much higher reliance on foreign debt. The economy drastically declined during this time, and unemployment was very high. And in 2005, there was a national plebiscite to grant citizenship to Hungarians living within the Carpathian Basin, but outside of Hungary's current borders. This is, and I have to explain this again for those not familiar. So this is the result of a very tragic dictates of Trianon after World War I. It's a very difficult topic, and it includes very many horrible memories for millions and countless Hungarians. I could go on about this, and it's a paramount issue for Hungarian nationalists, but I want to just let the audience understand that there are several million Hungarians who still live inside their ancient homelands, but outside the current borders of Hungary. So in many instances—
That include what we've heard about Romania?
Right. So Romania has three sections. It's Moldova, Wallachia, and Transylvania. And Transylvania, again, is historically a part of the Hungarian kingdom going back centuries. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail about it, but to make a long story short, Transylvania still has over maybe close to 1.5 million Hungarians living in Transylvania, which is now officially part of Romania. So the problem here is that in many instances, you have Hungarians that live in these places and they're still victims of chauvinistic attacks, merely being for who they are. And so, so I want to do this topic justice, but I probably have to dedicate a separate stream for this. I just really want to make everyone understand that if you look at every neighboring country around Hungary, they all have Hungarian minorities living in the border regions of these neighboring countries to a larger or lesser extent. Transylvania having the largest population of close to 1.5 million.
Right. So in 2005, there was a plebiscite to grant citizenship. And how did that go?
Right. So let me get back to that. Thank you for bringing me back to it. So sadly, the plebiscite failed. And Fidesz was not really that aggressive in promoting it either. And so it caused a serious rift between Hungarians living in Hungary and also Hungarians living in neighboring countries. It also, and it took over a decade to rectify this relationship. And I believe that Orbán and Fidesz learned a lot from this. Ultimately, and then I can circle, but ultimately Orbán in later administrations after 2010 did grant citizenship to all of these Hungarians. And then through that, he rectified that mistake from 2005. Still,
did he get a lot more support from those people? Did most of them go sway his way politically?
Yes, and it helped him a lot. So to his credit, he did rectify it. And again, we have to take what we have and look at it for the positive. But back then in 2005, he wasn't very. He didn't counter signal it, but he wasn't very aggressively promoting it either. This event was also a watershed moment for many Hungarian nationalists in Hungary. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of like their red pill moment back then. This is where you see the birth of radical right-wing movements such as Jobbik and the 64 County movement, among many others. So that's where you see a kind of a renaissance of Hungarian nationalism among the youth around 2005. And then it got even worse. I hate to say it, because during the 2006 elections, remember, the socialist neoliberal coalition was in power, and they won the elections in 2006. And then Orban's performance, in my view at least, was very lackluster. I mean, to me, it felt like he was defeated. He appeared at least defeated and lost. So who knows what was going on at the time. But at the time, we all thought that everything was lost. We thought it was over and we're heading towards some horrific neoliberal hellscape. That's what we thought in 2006.
So if you could just quickly bring us, because I know we'll have some questions, just in the interest of time. We might have to have you back for a special where we really, the whole show is about Hungary.
Yeah.
These people are loving it. Mama P is in the D-Live chat. She's saying, I usually don't like long streams. And she's saying, we need to keep, I want Nullus on for another hour. She's loving this. I don't know. We don't have another hour today, but I am glad to see the enthusiasm and that people are curious to learn about this. Very important. If you could just quickly take us to what the social liberal regime was like after that Orban defeat, just very briefly, how he came back, and then we'll get more, because I know people want to bring us into the present. Right now, what the policies and the culture is like, and again, that question of what we can learn from it and suss out some of the myths and facts about what we're being told in the States about Hungary right now.
Well, I'll try to condense everything if I can. Suffice it to say, in 2006, there was a huge protest because the socialist prime minister, there was a leaked recording that he admitted to lying, stealing, and cheating to stay in power. And that basically brought a bunch of people together to protest in front of the parliament. And then for months, they were there for months. And there was also the 50th commemoration of the Hungarian uprising. And this prime minister basically cracked down like really hard. And he, like, you know, the police beat protesters. They shot at them with like rubber bullets. They shot at them like directly at the, you know, at the body line, not above. And so people lost an eye. People got seriously injured. And it was chaos. And I would, just to make it really short, it was the time when the right-wing parties, the center-right and the right-wing parties, got very strong. And so by 2010, and then I'm trying to really rush this forward, by 2010, you know, that's why, among many other reasons, why parties like Fidesz and Jobbik got so strong. That's when Fidesz had an overwhelming majority, and Jobbik eventually had about 20% of the electorate. So we thought everything was perfect. But it turned out that by 2015, by the migrant crisis, you know, the trends were again going down for Fidesz and Orban. And then when the migrant crisis hit, then ultimately they doubled down and built the fence. But I have to make a very important point here about the fence and also about this crisis. Before the real impact was felt in Hungary, the only person who spoke up and warned everyone of this pending disaster was László Toroczkai, who's the mayor of Ásotthalom, which is a southern border town. At first, Fidesz didn't really react much, and the media pundits even mocked Mr. Toroczkai. But they soon changed their tune, you know, after hundreds of thousands of migrants just invaded Hungary. So again, to Orban and Fidesz's credit, once the danger was realized, they did react swiftly. But, you know, Mr. Toroczkai, who's now the head of the right-wing party, Mi Hazánk, Our Homeland, he was the one who really rang the warning bells. Now, again, I don't want to get into the nuances of the parties, but over time, sadly, parties like Jobbik, which were traditionally a right-wing, radical right-wing, and again, not extremist right-wing, but radical right-wing, meaning they wanted radical changes. I may want to make a very clear distinction. So they're not, you know, extreme right-wing parties. They're just very strong nationalist parties. Suffice to say, by 2018, 2019, Jobbik betrayed their base, sadly. And the party split into two. And Mr. Toroczkai basically created the Mi Hazánk, or Our Homeland movement, which is the party that I now support personally. And so right now, you know, so Toroczkai, Novák Előd Novák, his wife, and a bunch of former Jobbik party members created that party. And just
does that party have any power right now?
Right now, they have 2 members in parliament because they were a part of Jobbik and they just like split off. But now the coming elections in 2022, we're hoping that they get at least enough to get into parliament. And it looks like, well, they have a few mayors that are currently in various towns and cities. And they do have some representation in like municipal elections. But 2022 is going to be really a big test to see how much support they have. Right now, they're trailing around 6 to 7%, which is pretty good. Don't forget, this party was only established in 2019, actually. So it's a very new party.
Is there synergy with Fidesz, with Orban's party, or is it going to be an either or sort of thing?
Well, the way it works, I think, and this is also my mentality, and I think this is also the way Mihozank works. If Fidesz has policies that are beneficial for the nation, then of course, we have to support it. There's, it's an important thing to support. Maybe we can add additional comments to it by trying to make it better, but we don't want to counter-signal good policy, right? So obviously that's one thing. The other thing is now with Tucker Carlson's visit. And before I say that, though, I just want to make one more point about Mihozank, because I do like them a lot and I do want to support them. They are the only party in Hungary that explicitly, and they're a nationalist party, so that's very clear. But they also explicitly embrace the cause of all white people across the world. So Mr. Torocka has often talked about the northern civilizations. He's also talked about securing the interests of white people, no matter where they live. So I strongly recommend building ties with Mihozank.
How is that kind of rhetoric met in Hungary?
Positively, I think. I believe that the nationalist side understands this and they acknowledge this, and so I think that there's always a small segment that tries to counter-signal it, but for the most part, it's well taken. Obviously, like I said, there are issues in the surrounding countries that need to be resolved, but outside of that, I think in the greater scope, that this is well received and understood by Hungarians. So I would just wanted to make sure that people are aware that Mihozank is, in my personal opinion, the most explicitly pro-white party in Hungary. I would say that Fidesz is more like a Sivnat kind of conservative movement, if you will. More along the lines of maybe the America First movement in the United States, not as much old GOP, but more like, kind of the Tucker Carlson version of.
Maybe I'm wrong here, or maybe I'm just thinking of random tweets I saw, but isn't Orban's party more specifically pushing an immigration moratorium? And you said
Yes.
they were. So it seems a little more nativist. I mean, we hear about also this policy of, if a family has a certain amount of kids, they get tax breaks. What do you make of all of that? Is that anybody who's there, or is he saying ethnic Hungarians? Because that does sound to me more nativist than something like what America First talks about. Well, not even. Maybe I'm confusing. You meant America First, not
the GOP,
and not the Charlie Kirk types.
Right.
Okay, yeah, so I see. Okay.
So I would say, well, they're kind of in between America First and Charlie Kirk. Maybe that would be a good way of putting it. I think maybe. But needless to say, I mean, yes. Let's be very clear. So Fidesz has done an excellent job in terms of promoting family values. It's done an excellent job promoting identity, Hungarian identity issues. It's done an excellent job promoting Christian values and Christian issues. It's done an excellent job promoting families and family values and providing incentives for families to have more children. So I don't want to counter-signal Orban too much. I have my personal things about it, but I do want to make a point that he has done an excellent job in many things. And I would also go so far as to say that his achievements, in my view, are miles above any other achievements any kind of comparative Western politician in that space could even dream about achieving. And then maybe as a final thought to this, I just say that with Tucker Carlson's visits, I also want to emphasize that no matter how I may personally feel about Orban or Fidesz, and again, I'm not 100% against them. It's just that my preference is somewhere else, but I'm not against them. We regardless of the case, with these attacks going on against Hungary right now, with Tucker Carlson's visit, Hungarians, at least those Hungarians who have a strong Hungarian identity and that and are either patriotic or nationalistic, we put aside our differences and we present a common front against these external and even internal attacks by subversive anti-Hungarian and anti-white elements. And I think that's an important message. So,
Yeah.
That's what the most important part of this is.
What about any myths? This Iglesias guy on Twitter who is an anti-white, who's having a conniption because of Tucker Carlson's visit. The guy saying things like, "Oh, go live there then." All right, he's saying, among other things, that it's totalitarian, that you cannot criticize Orban, calling it a regime. Funny coming from America at present, but at any rate,
that's nonsense.
It's there's a difference between counter signaling and critique, and we want to be honest here and be able to suss out what we can learn or maybe what we can do better. Okay, so you already answered that. That's nonsense. So
yeah,
so
no one has been imprisoned. Right. I'm sorry to interrupt you. No one's been imprisoned in Hungary for their political beliefs. No one's lost their jobs because of political beliefs. You have a very vibrant, sadly subversive, but you do have a vibrant opposition media there. When they talk about 70% of the media, they're talking about the slice of a very limited slice, and they're manipulating statistics to lie. I mean, the most popular TV channels are all owned by these subversive elements. So again, and they're not being closed down. I mean, obviously, Orban and his group and Fidesz, and they're going to exert some kind of political will to represent their interests.
As anyone would.
But they're not doing things. I mean, there might be some issues. I do have some criticisms, but I don't want to get into that, to be honest with you, only because it's irrelevant to this particular point. The criticisms I have are not that they're anti-democratic. The criticisms I have is more that, there's a strong sense of nepotism there, and a little bit of money being put to to their own people, and I think that that should change. But that's a different.
How are they playing defense against all the pressures, internal and external? I'm sure being brought to bear, banking, otherwise, EU. That obviously Hungary is in a small minority of countries. I know there's talks of that alliance with Poland and other Central European countries. How have they even gotten to the point they're at, where they're able to rebuff the anti-white, globo-homo, as some people say, agenda of the EU and the way most Western nations are going right now?
Orban is a shrewd politician. He made mistakes in the 90s. He's made mistakes in the early 2010s, and he's learned a lot from it, I think. And what he's done is he's essentially taken control of government institutions. Every government institution is in his control.
That's probably what the Iglesias guy is trying to drum up then when he makes his criticism.
Well, but that's not a criticism, because if you look at the State Department of the United States, it's completely subverted. And it's against, regardless of who's in power, the State Department is always going to promote some agenda that might not represent what
of course, I'm just saying that's the little kernel he uses to try to justify his argument. I mean, it's amazing. Isn't it true? What did he do with the Open Society? Isn't it George Soros's foundation? Is that they had banned? What's the story there?
No, there was a university called the Central European University in Hungary, and the Central European University was in Hungary for many, many years. And what happened there was that Fidesz introduced a law that's saying if you want to be accredited in Hungary as a university, you have to prove that you have a campus in the country you're coming from. And Central European University only had a P.O. box in upstate New York. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but that's basically what they had. And so, Hungary said, well, you're not really a legitimate university, like, for example, the University of Indiana, which has a campus. And if they wanted to create a campus in Hungary, that's a different story. You just have a P.O. box somewhere, and now you're trying to create a university here. And so they said that all they want to do is, they said, we're not going to accept your accreditation and your Hungarian accreditation. So they told them you can continue to issue bachelor's degrees, American bachelor's degrees, because CEU gave both an American bachelor degree and a Hungarian degree. And what Fidesz said was, no, you can't get a Hungarian degree here because you don't have anything in the country of your origin. You have no campus there. And so the CEU, of course, made a big stink out of it, and they twisted this whole thing, and it was a loophole that Fidesz caught. I mean, it was a very smart and shrewd move, basically, from Orban, and he said, look, you can come here, build a campus in America, and we'll give it to you, right? And of course, they will never do that. And so then they made a big stink out of it, how repressive they are and how evil they are and everything. And it's not true. It's just not true. They said, you can stay here and issue bachelor's degrees if you want, but we're not going to give you a Hungarian accreditation for this. And that's why they left, right? Because that was one of their main selling points at the CEU, that you would get a dual degree, when you finished.
And Soros was behind that quote unquote university?
Yeah, well, he technically, yes, is the short answer is yes, but technically he provided the seed money for it, right? But it's like I'll give you $10 and then you put in $100 and then I will introduce my values into your system, kind of how that works, right? For every Soros dollar, you got to get 10 government dollars, and then Soros will tell you what values are going to be in there. That's kind of the logic. That's how it works everywhere, sadly, today. That's how they control our academia too, by the way. And it's our mistake because we allow our politicians to do this to us, right?
Jason, any questions from the chat as we're getting to be about that time?
Well, this has been so elucidative and gripping the entire time. And Nullus is quite the elocutionist. He's actually, he's a famous, folks, he is a famous poet. I have shared many of his poems in the past and will continue to do so in the future. And that's how we should, you're absolutely. Thank you so very much for the work you do in service to white well-being. It is deeply appreciated, and you are deeply appreciated, brother.
Thank you.
And thank you for appearing with us here today on Tap. Well, folks, we're about to tap out. It has seemed like 5 minutes, and we're already an hour and almost 15 around the other side. We have here, I'll do a quick refresh there. We had one question that you already answered as much. It was from, it's the Machiavellius asking about how much of the media is anti-white. And it seems like quite a bit of it is anti-white.
Sadly.
Which is, of course, immensely regrettable because people live their lives in their subconscious minds, that parts of the brain that don't know the difference between reality and fiction. And that's how we end up with people who believe that non-white people are being just murdered left and right by police officers and everything else that is part of the anti-white narrative. We have a question from Greek European saying that he has some Greek relatives that live in Hungary. And he was curious, of course, every European country, every Western country has non-white people, most of whom are wonderful, some of whom are not. And he's wondering, what percentage then of Hungary is white, is Western kind, is Westman? How many, what percentage then, I guess, on the other side is non-white?
Well, the largest non-white demographic in Hungary is the Gypsy demographic. The Gypsies originate from India, and they came to Europe through the Ottoman invasions, at least to Central and Eastern Europe. And with the Arab invasions, they arrived in Spain. The Gypsies in Hungary are about roughly 10 to 15%, sadly, but I would not say that they're more than 10% of the population. So the big issue is birth rates, and Mihozag, for example, has been, and Mr. Torotsky has been very adamant about promoting even more births among the native Hungarian population, because we have to be careful not to allow that there are in 10, 15, 20 years more Gypsy babies being born than Hungarian babies in Hungary. But for the moment, you're talking about a 10%. So I'd say overall, maybe 12, 13% of the population is maybe Gypsy, and then, variation of others, but maybe not even that much, 12% at most. And then they're also very regionalized. So you'll have some regions in Hungary where their concentration is higher. I hope that answered that question.
But
yes, absolutely.
The rest is West. The rest is Westman. So about
the rest is Westman. Yeah.
Over 80%. Someone just quickly, Rise of the Right is asking, but Andy also wants to know about Hungary's immigration system, if it's welcome to, how open is it to other Europeans and Americans?
Marry a Hungarian. Learn Hungarian. No, I'm very fortunate because I never knew this until after until the 90s. But technically, I was born Hungarian and also born an American at the same time. So according to the Hungarian government, since both of my parents were Hungarian citizens, I was automatically a Hungarian citizen. I didn't even have to apply or anything. I just had to ask for a passport. So yes, I have dual. I'm one of those suspicious guys with 2 passports.
But how open? It's not a bad idea these days. How open are they? The questioners want to know.
How open? They are
people from other countries, to white people from other countries.
They are. I mean, the people in general are open to other people. You know, anyone who learns even a little Hungarian, people are very happy and they're very proud when you can say a few Hungarian words in general. The government has stricter rules in terms of naturalization, but I think that it's not impossible to do. If you're a European Union citizen, you can live in Hungary. So let's say you have an Irish passport or a German passport, you can live in Hungary as a German or an Irishman, and then you can basically reside there indefinitely, because that's a part of the whole European Union agreement scheme. If you're an American, it's a little bit more difficult. You would have to apply for either marry a Hungarian or get a job in Hungary and stay there for an extended period of time, and then try to apply for citizenship over time. It's not impossible, but I would say that it's much more difficult for an American than it is for a person in the European Union.
Really quickly, we have Rambling Rattlesnake asking for the name again of the Hungarian party that is white positive, the leader that was saying that he's concerned for all white people around the world.
So the party is spelled M-I, and then the second word is H-A-Z-A-N-K, and that's Our Homeland Movement. That's the English translation of it. And the leader of the party, the president of the party, is a Laszlo. It's L-A-S-Z-L-O. And Toroczkai is spelled T-O-R-O-C-Z-K-A-I. He's on Twitter as well, so I would recommend following him on Twitter. He regularly posts some really good stuff, both about politics, also Hungarian politics, but also about general white well-being topics. And I think that he's worthwhile following.
Well, this has been magnificent. I have one more question I think we'll wrap up on, my own. And then after you finish with this question, you can tell us final thoughts and where folks can find you, brother. This question is most common misconceptions about Hungary that you have heard, and maybe the top 2 or top 1, and the truth in its place.
Well, the first one is always they confuse Budapest with Bucharest. You know, when you say that, are you from Bucharest? And then they think you're from Romania, and you're like, no. Budapest is not Bucharest. So that's one that's a very a popular one that you would hear. And then as another misconception, I guess, is the idea that I'm just thinking it's like what I've experienced, and I'm trying to think about it. Probably the relating to the women in Hungary, you know, like everybody says how pretty the Hungarian girls are, right? And you know, like do I know any Hungarian girls or something like that? And, you know, like I guess something like that.
What's the misconception? Nullus is about to tell us. They're even.
I don't know.
They're even prettier. They're even prettier than we realize, but we don't want to. I don't know if we want to give that secret away to everybody.
No, it's just, I wish I knew all these pretty Hungarian women. You know, that's all.
there might be an opportunity there. You could be a matchmaker.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The exact same thing. Nullus the matchmaker. Now everybody's going to. Yeah, this has been fantastic. Final thoughts and where folks can find you.
My website is abnormocracy.com. You can find me on Twitter under Abnormocracy. You can also find me under Gab under Nullus. I'm also on YouTube. I have a lot of my poems and a lot of different videos that I posted, as well as all the archived episodes of Conversation with the Wind on my YouTube channel. And then I'm also on Telegram under Abnormocracy. I have a channel there. And I'm also on Gab under Nullus. And where else am I? I guess that's pretty much it for now. I'm
a lot of white art collective musicians have used the spoken word in their songs.
Well, I do want to give a quick shout out to the White Art Collective, and I do want to say before we end this, I really want to make a point of saying that so I've always, you know, I want to shout out to Jeff Winston, Hyrith, JC Adams, Donald Kent, and even Snow Shadow, and I hope she's somewhere out there. and just to name a few, for Null, and Mama P and Handsome Horse. I just want to give a shout out to all of them, Jack White and everybody who encouraged me and continue to, and Amalahar, and I could go on with the names. Everybody who encourages me to pursue my artistic expression. Luke Mason, so hard. I'm not going to say it, Luke, because it's a curse, so I'm not going to say it in Hungarian. So Jeff asked me, to post the poetry show, and so everything flowed from there. Please tune in late fall for the continuation, season 3 of Conversations with the Wind, and also tune in this week to Imperium Art, where Donald Kent and I will have Jared as our guest. And that's this week, right, Jared? I believe.
6 o'clock Eastern, 11 o'clock UK this Thursday, yes. The 12th.
So please tune in, and I just want to shout out to the entire White Art Collective community and let everybody know I love you guys, and thank you so much for help inspiring me, and thank you for supporting everything that I'm doing. And thank you, No White Guilt, and thank you, Jared, also for always supporting my work. I don't want to forget saying that as well.
You're most welcome. Gratitude is all to you, good brother.
Thank you.
Mr. George, final thoughts and where folks can find you.
Well, anybody who liked today, all of these shows, 3.5 years now of Jason and I doing streams together, are cataloged for you on the afterparty.tv. So you can search shows by topics. We tag them by guests if you want to see, maybe, I don't know if this person has ever been on tap. It's all there. Backed up. We don't just use social media video platforms to back up and embed the videos. It's a little more secure. So please bookmark the afterparty.tv. My own site is thegreatorder.com. The different kind of content I've done. Of course, I've now turned most of my attention to music. That is my main passion. And I am contributing to the day and age we live in via being a recording artist. My latest song, What's In Us, is recently released. Did a video with it, very much a song of the moment. Jason here did a fantastic interview on Going Free, very graciously hosted me and asked some very interesting questions. It's hard to talk about creative process. I clipped out that 45 minutes and also put it as a standalone video on my channel, on my YouTube and Odysee yesterday. And I think that is it, since we already talked about my appearance on Thursday coming up on Imperium Art, 6 o'clock Eastern. But yeah, I might be forgetting something, but thegreatorder.com, please bookmark our website, sign up to mailing lists. We don't send out too much, but in case we got cut off, that's a better way. But that is not to say don't use social media. We have to use the tools we have. So follow, like, share, subscribe on all the different social media sites. You can find me and Jason listed on our where you can find us on our respective sites, and also the afterparty.tv. You can go to the Watch Live Now page, the first page on the menu, and there's a link to the different social media profiles Jason and I both have. But the main thing is share. Likes are nice and they help the algorithm a little bit, but it is so much more important to share what we're doing with different people even if they're a little outside this community. That is actually the point. That's important. What we're doing is normal and healthy, and we're not hiding it. And a lot of people feel the way we do. They're just too scared to talk about it. So please share, show that there are people talking about this in mature, honorable terms. We thank all of you who are here. Nullus, you were fantastic. You are an eloquent, lucid speaker. And a lot of people were saying as such in the chat. We look forward to talking to you soon. I look forward to talking to you and Donald on Thursday.
Thank you very much. I look forward to speaking with you on Thursday as well.
Well, folks, that's going to be about it. We're going to tap out. I want to give a big thank you, of course, to the great Mr. Jared George for everything he does, for making these taps into amazing, exciting, energizing, and instructive shows that they are. Of course, a big thank you to Nullus for showing up today and being the famous poet that he is in service to White Wellbeing. We deeply appreciate that service and look forward to many more wonderful poems and collaborations from Nullus with others. Big thank you to everybody who participated in the live chat today, especially our moderators, which were Fornell and Roy, doing an amazing job as always to keep everything as pristine as they need to be. A big hello too to everyone who is watching live, who is new to White Wellbeing, and to those who will watch in replay as well. We hope that you will continue to investigate the practice of going free, hang out with this community, be white positive, and we will look forward to seeing you all again